Close your eyes and imagine love. What do you see? Perhaps stolen glances across a crowded room, whispered promises under starlight, the gentle touch of intertwined fingers. Now forget everything you think you know about romance. Because in the shadow-soaked halls of medieval Europe, love was not a gentle emotion. It was a disease, a sickness that consumed the soul and rotted the body from within. Welcome to a time when physicians prescribed bloodletting to cure a broken heart, when the church declared passionate love a mortal sin, and when the very act of desire could damn your eternal soul. This is the story of how our ancestors understood love, and why their twisted vision would horrify us today. The Poison in Paradise. The year is 1184. In the royal courts of France, something sinister is taking root beneath the silk and ceremony. They call it courtly love, but this is no fairy tale romance. Picture this. A young knight, barely 20, wastes away in his chambers. His skin grows pale as parchment. His eyes sink deep into hollow sockets. He refuses food, refuses water, refuses all comfort. The court physicians gather around his bedside, shaking their heads in recognition of symptoms they've seen too many times before. He is dying of love, not metaphorically, not poetically. In the medieval mind, love was literally a fatal disease called amor herios, the lover's malady. Medical texts of the era describe it with the same clinical precision they used for plague or consumption. The symptoms were documented, catalogued, studied: loss of appetite, insomnia, obsessive thoughts, physical deterioration, and ultimately, death. But here's where the story turns truly disturbing. This wasn't considered tragic. It was considered proper. The physicians had their treatments, of course. They recommended cold baths to cool the patient's burning passion. They prescribed sexual intercourse with prostitutes to purge the dangerous humors. They suggested travel to distant lands to break the spell of obsession. And if all else failed, they turned to their most trusted remedy, opening the patient's veins and letting the tainted blood flow freely onto the stone floors. Imagine the scene. A young man strapped to a table, his arm extended over a basin, watching his life drain away, drop by crimson drop, all in the name of curing his heart of its affliction. The physicians believed they were saving his soul by destroying his body. The church's cruel doctrine. While the courts romanticized this suffering, the church had its own twisted perspective on love. To understand the medieval mind, you must first understand that passionate love between a man and woman was not just discouraged, it was heretical. The church taught that any love that burned too brightly, any desire that consumed too completely, was a distraction from divine love. Saint Jerome, one of the most influential church fathers, wrote that a man who loved his own wife too ardently was no better than an adulterer. Think about that for a moment. In medieval Christianity, loving your spouse with too much passion was a sin that could send you to hell. The church's ideal was cold, practical marriage, a union blessed by God for the sole purpose of producing children and managing property. Love, if it existed at all, should be a pale, controlled thing, like a candle flame carefully shielded from the wind. Any emotion stronger than mild affection was seen as dangerous, diabolical, demonic. This created a poisonous paradox in medieval society. On one hand, the courtly tradition glorified impossible, consuming passion. On the other, the church condemned such feelings as spiritually corrupting. Caught between these two extremes, medieval people developed a relationship with love that was fundamentally sick. They worshipped what they could never have. They desired what was forbidden. They built an entire culture around the celebration of suffering, unfulfillment, and emotional torment. The sickness spreads. By the 12th century, this diseased understanding of love had infected every level of society. In the great halls of nobility, troubadours sang ballads about knights who served their ladies like slaves served their masters. These weren't love songs. They were hymns to psychological abuse. Consider the story of Joffre Rudel, a troubadour who claimed to love Countess Hodierna of Tripoli, despite never having met her. He sailed across the Mediterranean just to see her face, fell ill during the journey, and died in her arms, moments after their first encounter. Medieval audiences found this deeply romantic. We should find it deeply disturbing. This was the era of the fine amour, refined love that demanded complete submission from the lover to the beloved. Knights would literally wear their ladies' colors into battle, carry her handkerchief like a holy relic, and write poetry comparing their devotion to religious worship. But the lady, bound by social convention and often married to another, could never reciprocate these feelings openly. The system was designed to ensure perpetual suffering. Love was only pure if it remained unfulfilled. Consummation was corruption. Happiness was failure. The perfect lover was one who spent his entire life in agony, serving a woman who could never truly be his. Think about the psychological damage this caused. Generations of men and women were taught that healthy relationships were impossible, that satisfaction was sinful, that the highest form of love was one that slowly destroyed you from within. The physician's madness. As amour heroes spread through the noble classes like a contagion, the medical establishment scrambled to understand and treat this epidemic of the heart. But their remedies revealed just how profoundly medieval people misunderstood human emotion and sexuality. The great physician Avicenna wrote extensively about lovesickness, describing it as an obsessive form of melancholia that corrupted the brain's ability to reason. His prescribed treatments read like torture methods. Patients should be terrorized with threats of death, subjected to extreme physical discomfort, or distracted with intense pain in other parts of the body. Other physicians recommended more creative approaches. They suggested showing the lovesick patient his beloved in the worst possible circumstances, dirty, diseased, or in the company of other men. The goal was to destroy the idealized image that had captured his imagination. If that failed, they might arrange for the patient to witness his beloved engaging in sexual acts with others, believing that disgust would cure desire. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the belief that lovesickness could be cured through strategic deception. Physicians would hire prostitutes to impersonate the beloved, reasoning that sexual release with a substitute would break the spell of obsession. When this inevitably failed to provide lasting relief, they would increase the frequency of these encounters, creating a cycle of compulsive behavior that modern psychology would recognize as sexual addiction. The medieval mind couldn't distinguish between love, lust, obsession, and mental illness. They treated romantic feelings like a fever to be broken, a poison to be purged, a demon to be exorcised. Women in the web of madness. But what of the women caught in this twisted system? While men suffered the theatrical agony of courtly love, women faced a different kind of psychological torture. They were simultaneously elevated as goddesses and degraded as temptresses, worshipped as pure angels, and feared as dangerous sirens. The courtly love tradition placed women on impossible pedestals. They were expected to be beautiful but modest, passionate but pure, inspiring but unattainable. A lady who accepted her lover's advances too readily was considered vulgar. One who rejected them entirely was cruel. The perfect courtly lady existed in a narrow space between desire and denial, forever walking the razor's edge of propriety. This created profound psychological pressure. Medieval women were taught that their value lay in their ability to inspire obsessive devotion while never fulfilling it. They learned to manipulate men's emotions as a form of social power, but they paid a terrible price for this influence. Their own desires were irrelevant. Their own happiness was secondary. They existed primarily as objects of male fantasy, beautiful mirrors reflecting men's spiritual struggles back to them. Many women internalized this dysfunction so completely that they began to see themselves as inherently corrupting. They believed their beauty was dangerous, their sexuality was evil, their very existence was a threat to men's spiritual well-being. Some retreated into religious life, trying to escape the poisonous dynamics of courtly society. Others embraced their role as unreachable goddesses, finding a kind of bitter satisfaction in the power to drive men to desperation. But all of them, in one way or another, learned that love was not about mutual happiness or genuine connection. It was about power, suffering, and the elaborate performance of impossible ideals. The breaking point. By the 13th century, this toxic understanding of love had reached a breaking point. The most extreme practitioners of courtly love were literally dying for their art. Nights wasted away in service to ladies who could never acknowledge them. Troubadours crafted increasingly elaborate songs about their own emotional torture. The nobility had created a culture that celebrated psychological self-destruction as the highest form of human experience. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of medieval love was how it infected the relationship between the sacred and the profane. The language of courtly love borrowed heavily from religious devotion, while mystical religious experiences were often described in erotic terms. The boundary between loving God and loving another person became dangerously blurred. Consider the mystic Marguerite Porete, who wrote of her love for God in language so passionate that the Church accused her of heresy. She described divine union in terms that sounded suspiciously sexual, spoke of being consumed by sacred fire, of surrendering completely to her celestial beloved. For this, she was burned at the stake in 1310. The medieval mind couldn't separate spiritual ecstasy from erotic passion, divine love from human desire. They lived in a world where all forms of intense emotion were suspect, where the heart itself was an enemy to be conquered rather than a guide to be trusted. The legacy of poison. As the medieval period drew to a close, the worst excesses of courtly love began to fade. The Renaissance brought new ideas about human nature, individual worth, and the possibility of earthly happiness, but the damage had been done. For centuries, Western civilization had been taught that love was essentially destructive, that desire led to damnation, that the highest form of human connection involved elaborate rituals of suffering and denial. We might think ourselves free from these medieval delusions, but their ghost still haunts our understanding of romance. The idea that love should be difficult, that easy relationships are somehow less meaningful, that passion requires sacrifice and suffering, these toxic beliefs echo down through the centuries. The medieval courtly lover, wasting away in service to an impossible ideal, bears an uncomfortable resemblance to modern people who mistake drama for depth, who confuse intensity with intimacy, who believe that if love doesn't hurt, it isn't real. The medieval period gave us the template for romantic obsession, for love as possession, for relationships built on inequality and unfulfilled longing. They taught us that the beloved should be placed on a pedestal so high that genuine connection becomes impossible. They showed us how to worship at the altar of our own emotional suffering. In those cold stone chambers where medieval lovers once lay dying of their passion, you can still hear the echo of their whispered prayers, not for happiness, not for fulfillment, not for the simple joy of human connection, but for the strength to suffer beautifully, to burn brightly, to transform their pain into something they could call sacred. And in that whisper, we hear the birth of every unhealthy relationship that followed, every toxic romance, every love that destroyed rather than created. For in the end, the medieval understanding of love was not love at all. It was the worship of love's absence, a dark sacrament celebrated in the cathedral of the human heart, where the altar was built from broken dreams, and the only prayer was pain.